Hello, my name is Scott Alsop and you may recognise my voice from the podcasts on MrAlsopHistory.com. You may even have been in one of my history lessons. If so, I'm sorry about that. Now, this video is designed to help students who are studying for the CIE IGCSE History course, and I hope that you're going to find it useful. Every year I spend time reading the examiner's report. This is a document that's written by the chief examiner. That's the person in charge of marking all your exam papers, in which they explain what students did well in the exam and what needs to be improved. Therefore, the examiner's report is a really helpful guide for discussing how to survive paper 2, which is seen by many people as the most difficult of the history exams. But really there's no need for you to panic, because with some guidance and, importantly, with a clear head on the day, you will be able to meet all the demands of the questions. Now, before looking at how to answer specific types of source questions on paper 2, there's a few general rules to remember. Firstly, remember that this is a source paper and, as such, requires you to use the sources in your answer. Now, it seems really obvious when I say that and point at you, but it should be obvious on the day when it's printed on each question. But one of the biggest ways that students lose marks in the exam is by failing to include specific examples from the sources. Let's face it, if you're answering a question by referring to what a written source says, you need to include a quote or a paraphrase from the source as evidence to support your point. Similarly, if you're using a cartoon, you need to make sure that you refer to specific details in the drawing and explain what they represent. Now, it's very likely that you'll know quite a lot of detail about the topic that you're being examined on. But remember that the examiner is not actually interested in how much you've managed to memorise about the topic. They want to see that you can use the sources to answer the question that you've been set. Contextual knowledge does often have an important part to play in reaching the higher levels in the mark scheme, but you need to use it relevantly. This knowledge could be used to explain the interpretation of a source. It's often very useful in helping to explain the message and purpose of sources, or it could also be used in conjunction with the provenance of a source. That's the bit in italics at the bottom that says who created the source, when and where. Knowledge isn't there to use as an alternative to the sources. You must use the sources as your main focus and only use your own knowledge to help to explain the source in context. Another common tendency is to spend a long time summarising the content of sources at length. Remember, the examiner already knows what the sources are. They're more interested in knowing whether you can use your understanding of the source to answer the question being asked. It's much better to directly address the question in the first sentence of an answer. This will help you to focus on what exactly is being asked. For example, if a question says, "What is the message of this source?" then your answer should begin, "The message of this source is." It's a complete waste of your time to go on for a paragraph describing an overview of the source when that doesn't address the question, because you won't get any marks for it. Remember also that questions need you to be critical about the sources. Avoid only using sources for their surface information. That's what sources say or what they show, since this is rarely enough to score the higher marks. The question at the back of your mind when reading a source or studying it for the first time really needs to be, what does the author or artist mean? What point are they trying to make? Why are they saying this? What is their purpose? Answering these questions involves making inferences about sources, and this is often best done by reading the source as a whole rather than by focusing on specific details. If you take a source by a sentence at a time, then sometimes you miss the big point that the source is trying to say. Therefore, study the whole thing first to get a feel for the tone, and then be able to work out the big point that it's making. The ability to infer the overall attitude, meaning, message or purpose of a source is a vital one. This is particularly important when using cartoons, since they often contain several little sub-messages. But there will be only one big point that the cartoonist really wants to make. That's the reason that they've gone to all the trouble of drawing it in the first place. However, these points are not just relevant to cartoons. Written sources often work in the same way. They need to be read and interpreted as a whole. A common type of question in paper 2 is one that asks, how far do sources agree? Now, these are the kind of distance questions that you're probably going to be used to from the 10-mark questions on paper 1. These questions need you to produce a balanced argument, an analysis showing both agreements and disagreements. It may well be that an agreement or disagreement is shown in the specific detail of a source, but that another might be shown in the overall message. This is why it's important to spend time studying the sources before writing, so that you know exactly what you're looking for. Another common mistake with agreement-disagreement questions is to answer by showing similarities and differences. Now, these are not the same thing, and consequently, numerous candidates lose marks by answering, in effect, the wrong question. An agreement-disagreement question is asking you about the message of a source. Frankly, whether they were both written in Britain or both written in 1936 might make their context similar. But if one source says that Nazi Germany is a threat to peace and the other says that nobody has anything to worry about, then their content is clearly not similar. They disagree. If, however, they both say that they want to see a peaceful world, then they agree. And that doesn't matter whether one was written by Chamberlain in 1938 or came from a newsreel presenter in 1936. Another common type of question is the one that focuses on how surprising something is. When a question asks you to, for example, explain if one source makes another surprising, you will always be placed in the bottom level of the marks if they fail to do what is asked, no matter how good the rest of the answer is. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but the best way to keep focused in your answer and to avoid this trap is to directly address the question in the first line of your answer. In this case, saying, in some way source X does make source Y surprising because, then you can go on to compare the content of the sources and to use this to support either surprising or not surprising. In these questions, you can't be wrong. As long as you explain ways that the source is or isn't surprising and use evidence from the sources to support your answer, then you will get the marks. As with all comparative questions though, you'll also score higher marks for arguing both sides. The best answers will often use their own knowledge of the period to support their arguments about surprising or not surprising. But remember that you should only do this after you've used the sources to create an argument in the first place. You can't get the higher marks unless you've ticked all the boxes for the lower ones. If you're asked why somebody wrote a source or drew a cartoon, again, it's a good idea to directly address the question in the first sentence of your answer. For example, the cartoonist drew this cartoon to show... Indeed, some of the best answers I've ever marked have clearly reached a high level in the mark scheme after just a few lines, because their answer was focused on the question from the very start. It's frankly pointless summarising the source for half a page if what you're writing doesn't answer the question, because you won't get any marks. When answering a question like this about a cartoon, remember that there is more to a cartoon than just thinking about what the picture shows. You need to focus on the bigger issue of what it is that the cartoonist is wanting to say. Cartoons are drawn for a purpose, and candidates reach the top level by being able to explain a legitimate reason or an important message, rather than just describe what each element of the cartoon shows. On paper 2, the big marks come on the last question, which is worth a whopping 12 marks. However, many students throw away a lot of the marks by not answering the question in the way that they need to. So, here's my advice. Firstly, the question is about the sources, so make sure that your answers are based on the sources. Secondly, there will always be some sources that support the statement and some others that disagree with the statement. The key is to explain how some sources support and how other sources disagree. It's not enough just to assert this. You must explain it by using specific details from the sources and by showing why they support or disagree. Because. Thirdly, sometimes a source can be interpreted in different ways and can be used both for and against the statement, but not every source. Fourth, it's not necessary to use all the sources. Sometimes there might be a source that doesn't really have a bearing on the statement. The quality of the explanation is just as important as the number of sources used. As long as you're using most of them, you'll be okay. Fifth, candidates can simply go through the sources in the order in which they appear in the paper, explaining whether each one supports or disagrees with the statement. Alternatively, you might instead create a balanced argument by dividing your answer in half and explaining firstly all the sources that support the statement and then all the ones that disagree. Finally, there are extra marks awarded for evaluation of the sources. This means that you can get bonus marks for assessing the sources critically, for example by mentioning whether the source is reliable or not, and why. Now remember that this little advice video is simply here to provide guidance and advice on how to answer the most common source questions that appear on the CIE IGCSE History Paper 2. The best way to see how well you put it into practice is through testing yourself, and your teacher, if you're in my class then obviously that's me, will be able to point you towards past papers and mark schemes to help you. If you want more general guidance on answering source papers, then you can visit my other podcasts on MrAllsopHistory.com. There's one called Succeeding at Sourcework that you'll find useful. Although that's not designed specifically for CIE Paper 2, it still contains lots of great tips that you might find helpful.